The October 2025 government shutdown is not just another case of Washington gridlock. It's actually the climax of a story that's been building for months, and in many ways, for decades. To understand why the government is dark today, we have to retrace the path that led here. The compromises that postponed conflict, the policy fights that never really ended, and the narratives about government itself that shaped how every step was interpreted. Back in March, when Congress passed a continuing resolution to keep agencies open, the move was framed as a reprieve. Lawmakers told the public it was only a stopgap, a way of buying time until the real fight later in the year. That prediction was not just accurate, it was inevitable. The issues that were sidestepped then, from healthcare protections to the fallout of the one big beautiful bill, did not fade away. They gathered strength, waiting for October. Now the reckoning has arrived. This shutdown is not merely a pause in government services. It is a confrontation where all those deferred disputes, institutional maneuvers, and political narratives collide at once. What follows is the story of how we reached this moment. How March set the stage, how healthcare became the connective thread, how executive tactics and legal limits escalated the fight, and how the struggle over government's role has turned a budget standoff into something much larger. For decades, the groundwork for the present shutdown was laid by a persistent campaign to erode faith in public institutions. The idea that government is bloated, corrupt, and unnecessary did not emerge by chance. It was cultivated through repeated defunding of agencies, deliberate administrative sabotage, and a political narrative that equated public service with waste. Corporate actors benefited by weakening regulatory oversight. Ideological factions within the Republican Party treated every fiscal deadline as an opportunity to shrink the state. What we're seeing now is the logical culmination of that long cultivation. When the government closes its doors, the experience of absence is actually meant to prove that government itself is superfluous. Yet the opposite lesson emerges, because the instant disruption demonstrates just how deeply ordinary life depends on those institutions. The shutdown is therefore not just a breakdown in governance alone, but actually a confrontation with decades of anti-government conditioning. The immediate mechanics of this shutdown are rooted in March 2025, when Congress passed a continuing resolution that carried funding through the end of the fiscal year but left the underlying disputes unresolved. At the time, lawmakers openly acknowledged that they were, in a sense, just buying time. The expectation of a bigger fight in October wasn't accidental, but in fact planned, a deliberate deferral that stored up conflict rather than resolving it. That March decision is what made the October confrontation inevitable. It transformed the new fiscal year into the staging ground for an existential debate, concentrating disputes over healthcare, tax policy, and entitlement funding into a single explosive moment. Without the earlier postponement, the current crisis might still have occurred, but it would not have carried the same inevitability or intensity. Central to the October clash is healthcare. Medicaid funding and ACA subsidies, already reshaped by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act earlier in the year, became the core issues around which negotiations crystallized. Democrats argue that protections for affordable care cannot be sacrificed, framing this not as a narrow budgetary fight, but as a struggle for the survival of social guarantees. Republicans, in contrast, seek to separate these policy battles from appropriations, insisting that funding must continue without embedding health reforms. The shutdown is the direct result of this impasse. Both sides had previewed this conflict months earlier, but now the confrontation has materialized with greater ferocity because it was deferred rather than settled. The result is that healthcare has become the connective thread tying together every shutdown episode of 2025, the issue that both anchors the dispute and shapes how the public perceives it. What distinguishes this shutdown from earlier standoffs is the escalation of institutional tactics. In March, the battle was waged through cloture votes, filibusters, and debates over clean versus conditioned continuing resolutions. These were procedural disputes, dramatic but bounded within the normal functioning of the Senate. By October, the tools have grown sharper. the administration has signaled willingness to use impoundment, or withholding funds that Congress has already appropriated. Agencies have begun shuttering operations in a more aggressive way, redefining which services count as essential. Unions report not only furloughs but threats of permanent reductions in force, which is an escalation that shifts the shutdown from a temporary inconvenience into structural reconfiguration. These moves press against the limits of the Anti-Deficiency Act and the Impoundment Control Act, statutes that normally serve as guardrails. Litigation is already underway, signaling that the shutdown is no longer confined to politics alone but is, in fact, spilling into the legal system as a test of constitutional boundaries. The narratives around the shutdown reveal another layer of continuity and inversion. In March, Republicans cast themselves as the party of responsibility, preserving stability by passing a stopgap measure. Progressives warned that this merely delayed a reckoning and weakened their bargaining power. By October, those positions are reversed. Democrats claim the mantle of protectors, refusing to reopen government without securing social protections, while Republicans denounce them as hostage-takers. The language of clean and dirty resolutions of hostages and stability remains constant but has simply flipped hands. This portability of narrative frames underscores that the shutdown is as much a battle of interpretation as it is of appropriations. Each side fights not only for policy concessions but for control of the storyline, knowing that public blame and credit will shape the upcoming midterms. The timing of the shutdown is crucial to its political meaning. In March, proximity to the midterms was distant enough that compromise seemed safer. By October, with the 2026 elections visible on the horizon, the stakes are higher. The shutdown now functions as a testing ground for campaign messaging, a dry run for arguments that will be made in the electoral arena. Each party is less concerned with minimizing disruption in the short term and more concerned with shaping how voters assign responsibility in the long term. That temporal shift makes the current standoff qualitatively different. What was once a tactical delay has now become a strategic confrontation, deliberately prolonged to test endurance and messaging ahead of the campaign cycle. Markets and international observers add further weight to the confrontation. Earlier in the year, when the Rescissions Act cut foreign aid and eliminated future CPB funding, warnings about US reliability remained somewhat abstract. Now, with a government shutdown underway, credit rating agencies and financial markets are directly responding. Warnings of credit downgrades and volatility confirm that domestic brinkmanship is eroding global confidence. The March deferral signaled instability, and now, the October shutdown just validates it. Each cycle of conflict accumulates evidence for investors and allies that the United States is caught in a self-inflicted cycle of dysfunction. This international echo amplifies the stakes. The shutdown is not just about internal governance but about America's global standing. What emerges from this convergence is a cycle of escalation. Shutdowns are no longer extraordinary threats, but have become recurring instruments of leverage. Each unresolved fight makes the next confrontation more inevitable, more intense, and more deeply embedded in institutional behavior. The March compromise conditioned October, and October will now condition the battles that follow. This cycle is self-reinforcing, a feedback loop in which each round of brinkmanship guarantees the next will be heavier. So the present shutdown is both a specific political moment and a structural phenomenon. It's something that reflects the long cultivation of distrust, the unfinished fight of earlier in the year, the centrality of healthcare as a dividing line, and the escalating willingness to test institutional limits. The current standoff isn't simply a fiscal dispute, it's actually an ideological confrontation that's been decades in the making. It's a theater in which Americans are being asked to reckon with what government means and why it matters. Each disruption, from delayed paychecks to shuttered programs, is more than just inconvenience. It's evidence that life without functioning public institutions is pretty much intolerable. The struggle over framing will, in the end, determine whether the public concludes that shutdowns prove government's dysfunction or, maybe, prove its indispensability. The longer the disruption continues, the harder it becomes to sustain the fiction that government is irrelevant. And when the resolution finally comes, the terms on which it ends will decide not only the fate of healthcare funding or appropriations procedures, but also the broader contest over whether the United States continues to accept the myth of government's uselessness, or, perhaps, begins to rebuild a recognition of its necessity. This shutdown is the culmination of years of strategic sabotage, but it's also the moment when that sabotage may finally be exposed for what it really is. A cynical ploy by politicians to divert attention from their own failure to address real problems.